Okay. All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Adam Carson. I am an associate planner with the Rockland County Planning Department and the executive director of the Rockland Municipal Planning Federation. The Federation is a nonprofit organization that provides up-to-date educational sessions on relevant topics for Planning Board and Zoning Board of Appeals members so they can make more informed decisions regarding the development applications that come before them. We are fortunate to have back with us tonight Chris Eastman and Paula Gilbert from the Local Government Training Program at the New York State Department of State to give us an overview of affordable housing. Before we begin, I'd like to address a couple items. My email address is on the screen now. If you are on a board outside of Rockland County and need a certificate of attendance, please email a request to me that includes your name, municipality, and board. The Federation maintains attendance records that we share with towns and villages within Rockland County, so local board members do not need a certificate. Next, everyone is muted and will remain so. If you have a question, please use the Q&A function, which you can find at the top or bottom of your screen. I will be monitoring the Q&A and I will relay your questions to Chris and Paula during the session. So before I turn things over to our speakers, I'd like to begin with a couple of questions for everyone out there. I'm going to launch a poll. And if you could take a moment to answer, it's a single choice, but to what extent do you agree with the statement, the lack of affordable housing is a serious problem? Strongly disagree, disagree, no opinion, agree, and strongly agree. I'll give you a half minute to finish that. So clearly this is not a scientific poll, and the fact that you're here tonight, I would think would skew the results somewhat. All right, we have 77% people participating. Looks like it's one more went. All right, I think it's been about a minute, so I'm going to end the poll and share the results. So as you can see, only a couple people, one person strongly disagrees, one person disagrees, 3 with no opinion, and the remainder, 30% of the respondents agree with that statement, and over half, 52%, strongly agree. So that's over 80% agreeing or strongly agreeing. Now, another question. So now that most people agree that it is a problem, I'd like to decide what is the best method to increase housing affordability. And it's a little unfair that I'm making you choose a single choice, but if you can go through them, I put up some options. You can increase the funding or availability. Oh, I didn't launch the poll, sorry. Increase the funding or availability of housing vouchers. Government subsidies for dedicated affordable housing, that should say projects. I didn't realize it would get cut off. Wonder if I can make the poll bigger. There. Mandatory set-asides of a percentage of new units for lower income households, also known as workforce housing. Amend local zoning to allow increased residential density. Eliminate regulatory hurdles to residential development, such as SECRA. Or if there's something I didn't think of, please check the other. So we're at about almost 40% have answered. I'm hoping the people who pick other aren't just picking that because they can't decide. I'm hoping that they have a specific policy in mind. But I really can't control that, so I guess it's okay. All right. People are still answering. Okay, at 84%. There's a couple stragglers out there still. 30%, 90%. All right, that's pretty good. I'll take an A-. All right, I'm going to end the poll now. And I'll share the results. Hoping you all can see that. So 19% thought to increase the availability of funding of housing vouchers, 39% government subsidies, 29% mandatory set-asides. Oh, surprisingly, only 3% amend local zoning to allow increased residential density, 3% eliminate regulatory hurdles to residential development, and 6% saying other. So the reason I wanted to do that was just to kind of demonstrate, or I hoped it would demonstrate, and I hope it did, that while everyone or most people agree affordable housing is a problem, exactly what to do about it is a little bit unclear. So with that, I was thinking, it's a phrase that you may have heard before, Miles' Law, where you stand depends on where you sit. That was a quote. I've been thinking about that when I've been thinking about affordable housing. And I had to look up where it came from. I learned about Rufus E. Miles, who was born in 1910, died in 1996, who was an administrator and assistant secretary for a couple government agencies. He was mainly talking about people's opinions with regard to where they are within an organization, within the bureaucracy. But I think that this quote is fairly universal. I think it has a lot of application, but I thought perhaps we could have a amended Miles' Law, where you stand on affordable housing depends on where you sleep. And I just had this thought that a person's approach to the issue of affordable housing will likely vary depending on if they are a homeowner in a single family neighborhood, a young adult just beginning their life independent from their family, or perhaps a real estate professional or developer. So helping us make sense of all this tonight, we have Christopher Eastman and Paula Gilbert. Christopher Eastman has been a manager of the local government training program at the New York Department of State since 2009. He's also worked as a city planner, a county planner, and for the Preservation League of New York State. He received his master's in regional planning from State University of New York at Albany in 2002. And we also have Paula Gilbert, who is a local government specialist with the Division of Local Government Services. Prior to joining the team at the Department of State in 2017, she worked for 3 years as the executive director and 2 years as an urban policy associate at the Neighborhood Preservation Coalition of New York State Incorporated, a technical assistance and advocacy not-for-profit organization working with more than 140 affordable housing and community development organizations within the urban and suburban neighborhoods of New York State. Paula has a BA in Urban Studies and Planning and a master's in regional planning from the University at Albany, where she interned with the New York Planning Federation. So please join me in welcoming back Chris and Paula.
Great. Thanks again for having us. And this is such an important topic. It's a topic that it seems to be always more and more people seem to be talking about it, especially as we move forward. Hopefully putting COVID behind us. So tonight, unfortunately, I wish I could say that this presentation solves the issue. It would be great if that was as easy as it was, as, maybe updating your zoning codes and, making it a little bit easier for, for these types of housing to show up in your community. But unfortunately, in a place with, where the private market can be so volatile and so crazy, and it's so hyper local that I struggle myself with this course because, at least from the perspective of my past, what works in one community may not work in another community. It's just, unfortunately, we're starting to get towards, crisis levels for housing. And this was before even COVID happened. And unfortunately, it seems like sometimes it's even a little bit worse now. So tonight we will talk pretty briefly about housing. We're not going to go over absolutely everything, but this is really just to kind of get planning and zoning board members mostly thinking about the issue in your community and maybe thinking about some of the tools you might use to try to address affordability in your community. And Chris, I don't think I can control the slides, so I think you're going to have to go forward for me. Great. So tonight, this is just very brief, what we're going to go over, which is what affordable housing is, some of the history behind it, and some of the trends that we're seeing nationally and inside New York State. We'll talk a little bit about homelessness, and then we'll talk about the affordable housing laws, policies, and programs that you should know on the local level and how to then kind of incorporate that into your own plans at home. And some of the land use tools and strategies you can use to try to address affordability in your community. We'll also talk about funding programs because we often get a lot of questions about this from local officials. It won't go over everything because there's a million programs out there, but the big ones we'll touch on. We'll briefly run you through the development process, and we'll talk a little bit about housing preservation before concluding. And a couple years ago, this book, Evicted: Poverty and Profit in the American City, was kind of the talk of the town in terms of inside the affordable housing industry. And I really thought that this quote was pretty good. Decent affordable housing should be a basic right for everybody in this country. The reason is simple: without stable shelter, everything else falls apart. And that is true. We find that, people who don't have stable housing usually have worse health outcomes. Students don't do as well in education. People are often depressed, so there's issues there. Economically, it causes all sorts of problems. So we won't talk about all of that, but I think it kind of rings true that I think home is where the heart is. And if you have really difficulty achieving affordable housing there, it has a pretty significant impact on the rest of your life. So we can go to the next slide. And we used to have a different course, and I've been kind of over the course of the pandemic updating it. And so this is kind of our first time running it, kind of running this newer show. So we'll see what happens as we go over the course of the night too. So I wanted to start here with a state and a nation in crisis. This is some headlines from the past couple of weeks that I've pulled from my own news feed. So we have Forbes here saying inflation, soaring rents, and the housing crisis. Up in the Finger Lakes, Americans are overpaying for homes, affordable housing is gone. And from Governing Magazine, record inflation deepens America's affordable housing crisis. So, and there was a million others, but I didn't want to totally overdo it on the slide. But these are just some things over the past couple of weeks that we're seeing in the mainstream media. And we can go to the next slide. So we'll start again with the basics here. So you can go to the next slide. So what is affordable housing? The common used definition is housing units where the occupant pays no more than 30% of their gross income on housing costs, which includes their taxes and utilities. And families that are paying more than 30% of their income on housing are considered cost burdened. And then those who pay 50% or higher are considered to be severely cost burdened. In fact, Adam was nice enough to send over a document from Rockland County that was kind of put together for HUD, the U.S. Housing and Urban Development Agency, and it finds that 37% of homeowners are cost burdened in Rockland County, as well as 57% of renter households. And for those that are severely cost burdened, you have 35% of renters and 16% of homeowners. So it is a worse problem for renters, with 35% of renters in your community or in your county that are paying more than 50% of their household. But 16% of homeowners is really scary too, mostly because that shows that you might not see the struggle on the outside, but there's clearly people in your community that are struggling. And so affordable housing covers housing within the means of households that may occupy middle, moderate, or low income housing. And of course, that covers your sales price or your rental amount. So that is a very basic overview of it. We can go to the next slide. So here, taking a look more at the local level on like at the state side, is the National Low Income Housing Coalition puts together the Out of Reach report every year. From the 2021 report, we found that the fair market rent in the open marketplace for a 2-bedroom apartment is $1,700 in New York State. So in order to afford this rent without paying more than 30% of your income, a household must earn either $5,800 monthly or about $70,780 annually. So that's a pretty significant amount when you think about it. I think the median household income for the entire state is somewhere around, I think, $55,000 or $60,000. So that goes to show you that there's some people really struggling in terms of just being able to afford a 2-bedroom apartment in most places in New York City. There are a lot of people that then tell me that there's, this one, I feel like sometimes people argue because they're like, well, there's such a difference because, upstate and Binghamton is not the same as, downtown Manhattan, which is absolutely true. But that's why I decided to pull out the statistics in this table. So we find that 28% of owners in New York State overall are housing cost burdened, and 52.2% of renters are. So that's a pretty scary amount. It means that, more than 50% of our renters are struggling here in New York State. And it's definitely not good that we have more than a quarter. And then we take a look at the upstate and downstate. So being Rockland County, and most of our audience here is from what I consider the Metropolitan Commuter Transportation District. So it's New York City plus Suffolk, Nassau, Westchester, Putnam, Dutchess, Rockland, and Orange counties. You have 34.5% of owners struggling and paying more than 30%, and 53.2% of your renters. So pretty scary, not great statistics to say. I mean, it's also not necessarily surprising because I think everybody knows that New York is a high cost state to live in. But the less money that you have for your housing means that, it trickles down to the rest of, your lifestyle, not being able to pay for food or daycare or, your medical expenses and clothing, transportation, so it makes it really difficult when you're constantly struggling. So working at minimum wage of $12.50 an hour each week, you would have to work 94 hours to afford a modest 1-bedroom apartment in New York at fair market rent. So not great. We can go to the next slide. So from the federal terminology, we have usually our affordability is figured out by things called the area median income. It's calculated annually by HUD. And your income, of course, is adjusted for your household size. So people who have more kids, usually it ends up with the income levels drop in terms of being able to qualify for subsidized housing. So lower income is considered 80% or less of median income. Low income is considered 50 to 80% AMI, area median income. And very low income is below 50%, and extremely low income is 30% or lower. And that community is the hardest in terms of housing because even if they're subsidized, they can only pay 30%, which means that you're going to have a larger affordability gap in terms of developing as well as maintaining those units. So it does make it difficult. And of course, lower income people make up 40% of the nation's population. So we're talking about all different, sorts of people and walks of life, really struggling to find safe and affordable housing for them to raise their families. And the next slide kind of takes us through what your area median income would be if it was based at $60,000. So as you can see, at 30% AMI, a household of one would need to qualify with $18,000. If it was two, it's $20,000, and it goes up from there. At 50% AMI, which is considered very low income, you have a household size of one would be about $30,000 to qualify. And 80% AMI is considered lower income housing, which is where most of our affordable housing projects kind of lie, is usually it's trying to find units for those at 80% AMI. In this scenario, that would be about $48,000 for a household of one, and two, it would be $55,000. So again, it's calculated annually, and it's calculated based on where you are. So downstate, of course, in Rockland County in the lower Hudson Valley, your area median incomes are probably going to be higher than they are here in more upstate New York areas. So it kind of evens out the playing field for different areas, because we realize that housing markets are very different depending on, geographically where you live. We can go to the next slide. And quickly, we'll just go over some trends that we're seeing. This is from the state of housing. It's a report that's put out from Harvard University every single year, and they found that the biggest issue that we're seeing nationwide is persistent unaffordability. Even before COVID, the nation was facing crisis level housing affordability issues. In 2019, we had 30% of households were housing cost burden. 1 in 7 are paying more than 50% of their income on housing. Now that we know from Rockland County, that's 50% of your renters in your own community. So I would say persistent unaffordability is pretty consistent here in New York State as well. We also have growing racial disparities. The racial gap in home ownership keeps growing. In 2019, Black home ownership remained virtually flat at 42.8% compared to 73.3% for white, 46.3% for Hispanic, and 57.3% for Asian households. So Black families are lagging behind the home ownership rate than everybody else, which is problematic because home ownership is still the main source of wealth in the United States. So families paying more for rent, it slows their ability to save for a down payment to become homeowners themselves. And housing cost burdens were greater for households of color, especially for renters. So this is where people feel like they can't catch up. They've been blocked out of it. There's also, failed urban policy of the past with things like redlining that still is very persuasive in our community. So this is, one part of our community that seems to keep getting somewhat held back in terms of being able to achieve the American dream. We also have a lot of people think that, younger generations, millennials, Gen Zers don't want to be homeowners themselves. Studies and surveys have mostly found that that is false, and that people normally do want to be homeowners. It is what we consider the American dream. We also have widespread housing insecurity. So of course, this is going to probably continue after, as we're starting to kind of pull out of the pandemic, but the economic fallout was pretty substantial in a lot of places, combined with the ongoing housing affordability. It keeps putting millions at risk of losing their homes. A lot of low-wage, workers lost their jobs, and economy still hasn't completely recovered, and a lot of those people haven't necessarily been able to get back into the workforce. And again, renters and homeowners of color and low-income households disproportionately lost income following the onset of the pandemic, and many are still struggling to make housing payments. In fact, I think there's a lot of people in the affordable housing industry themselves that are probably losing sleep because we're not quite sure what evictions and foreclosures are going to look like maybe a year or two from now. And of course, we have major barriers to home ownership. It's not just down payment barriers, but it's harder to seek credit. We've seen a lot of changes since the Great Recession of 2008. And that's when we saw basically housing production completely kind of come to a halt. It did start to kind of come around again, but now we're dealing with supply shortages, and we never made up that kind of loss of housing units in that kind of 5 to 6, 7 years in between. So that's further putting a pinch on the market in terms of being able to buy homes or find new places to live, even if you have the resources to do so. And we can go to the next slide. So we're also seeing in New York State the pressure from short-term rentals as well. They routinely yield 30% more profits to investors than long-term residential leases. And their presence increases surrounding property values, which might be great for some of the neighbors, but it tends to also increase the long-term rental costs as well, sometimes further pricing out the locals. It's especially difficult to house lower income employees in tourist hotspots. We see this all over a lot of upstate New York right now, especially in touristy places that, people working in a coffee shop in, Lake Placid can't afford to live in Lake Placid. And municipalities are sometimes losing out on occupancy taxes, unlike from hotels and traditional stays where that automatically gets funneled into the county. They're sometimes hard to track. However, technology is getting a little bit better. You can use things like AirDNA to try to see what the short-term rental situations are in your community. I was kind of clicking around on it the other day. It doesn't seem to be as serious of a problem in Rockland County as it is on this map here is Lake Placid, where they only have about 2,000 housing units in their village, and they have 674 active rentals. So that is not great because they can't afford to hire police officers because there's residential requirements, and people can't afford to live there on a police officer salary. The same goes for teachers as well. So, white collar jobs that you think it shouldn't be all that difficult to find housing, unfortunately, sometimes in some of these more touristy places, it's making it all that much more difficult to find housing. So you have to drive longer distances to get to work. We can go to the next slide. We are also seeing a more corporate or Wall Street investments pressure in housing as well. This isn't necessarily as much of New York State as we're really seeing it in the American South. So we have Wall Street firms have been buying up single family homes for cash in hot markets. The homes then get rented to many people who are now priced out of being first-time home buyers. Some of the firms are also building completely new residential subdivisions for just the purposes of renting. So it's kind of like seeing factory towns all of a sudden show back up again. We're starting to see like big employers get into the business of housing, which we've never really seen before. And of course, there's a tech impact. There's online platforms that are making it easier and faster for investors to buy. So again, if you're trying to get your ducks in a row to buy your first house, you can't really compete with people, when they have a cash offer and you still have to, go through an FHA loan process. So unfortunately, we're seeing that. Like I said, more in the South. We will probably start seeing it more in the North as well, but it's very crazy. They actually did 60 Minutes, I think 3 weeks ago, did a whole, an entire section or an entire story on this issue. It was pretty crazy, but again, these are, in fact, it's the one on the bottom. Would be home buyers be forced to rent the American dream rather than buy it? So it was pretty crazy, but we're seeing more and more of that, unfortunately. So we can go to the next slide. And of course, now we turn to COVID and eviction. So we had a COVID-19 eviction moratorium in New York State that expired on the 15th of January. So we're a little nervous here about this. There was the $2 billion emergency rental assistance program. It ran out of money, so not everybody that qualified was able to get in the door. It's supposed to keep tenants in place, but again, there was long lists, it was difficult, and sometimes you needed the sign off of your landlord, and some landlords didn't want to sign off on that. So people were precluded from participating in the program itself. So again, advocates are saying there isn't enough funding in the program. Not all the landlords signed the paperwork. So in Albany County, I just know this locally because it was in the paper, between January 1st and February 14th of this year, 471 eviction cases were filed in the county court building. And that's just Albany. There was 152 in Rensselaer County and Schenectady County. Evictions aren't well tracked upstate outside of the 5 boroughs, so it's more difficult for us to kind of have an idea of what's happening. But we did know pre-pandemic that 11,000 people were being evicted in the city of Syracuse annually. So we do know that evictions tend to be pretty bad, but since they're so hyper-local in county courts, it's more difficult for us to keep track of how great the problem is. So we can go to the next slide. And of course, with evictions, there's of course the thought of foreclosures and what's going to happen next. So the COVID-19 Emergency Eviction and Foreclosure Prevention Act of 2020 ended again on January 15th. So that provided a mandatory stay of any foreclosure or eviction proceeding in which a person filed a hardship declaration with the court, like they lost their job, or a family member got sick, etc. The Governor Hochul did open the Homeowner Assistance Fund. It was $539 million to homeowners who were behind on their mortgage payments. But again, that was a fund that opened and then closed as quickly as it had opened because the demand for it was so high. And of course, we won't probably know how bad the problem is until a couple years from now, since New York State is a judicial foreclosure state. We have yet to see the long-term impact, which means that it has to go through the kind of the housing court process. Usually, I think we have the second slowest foreclosure process in the country. I think the average is usually about 2 years for it to go from papers being served to finally going through with the foreclosure. In fact, in the height of the foreclosure crisis after the Great Recession of 2008, it didn't hit us until 2015. New York had the second highest home foreclosure inventory in the United States, with 1 out of every 21 homes in foreclosure, which is a pretty scary statistic out there. Slowly we've gotten better, but then of course we got slammed with COVID. So we have yet, probably in the next couple of years, we'll have more of an idea of how bad it's going to get. So we can go to the next slide. Of course, there are tons of challenges for affordability in this realm. So we have rising new housing costs. It's crazy, even throughout the pandemic, how crazy the housing market has gotten, especially in the Hudson Valley, where we saw a lot of people maybe coming out of New York City looking for places to kind of ride out the pandemic. There's, of course, a lot of regulations which can lead to extended development time. You know, if an affordable housing developer needs to come before maybe a planning board or a zoning board 2 or 3 times, it kind of adds more time, and time is money, of course. And it also sometimes opens up the door to more public opposition, which could then also slow down the opportunity of building. There's an older housing surplus. The idea is, if you buy or rent in a certain amount in an older home, it's going to cost less. we're finding that in reality is not necessarily true. So as people kind of filter out of that, it's supposed to become more affordable for lower incomes. But again, we're not really seeing that. Leadership and changes, programs have changed as well, sometimes in a short period of time. There's consumer patterns and belief. A lot of times we see local opposition to affordable housing and rental housing in general in around New York State. Unfortunately, it's pretty common in wealthier communities. And then we have also exclusionary housing practices happening as well. And of course, the pretty simple conclusion here is that affordable housing is not being adequately addressed in the marketplace. And I just like a couple of these things that I see on the side. The share of the millennials who can't afford to buy a home is 74%. And the top reason renters don't currently own is because they can't save for their down payment. So as as their rents start rising, it's harder and harder to put away money to be able to do that. And I only have like anecdotal information on that, but we're starting to see reports, at least here in the city of Albany, where people who are renting are up for renewing their lease, and landlords are like increasing their rents by like 30%, which is crazy. And how you're supposed to be able to kind of keep up with that is difficult. So we can go to the next slide. So of course, the benefits of affordable housing, who might need help. It's our young people in our communities, our seniors, single parent families, young families, veterans, former employees that are downsizing, your family member or friend, or really honestly any one of us. And giving access to everyone really helps our entire community. It helps our education, helps the workforce. Providing workforce housing makes it so that people don't have to drive as far enough away to get to your community to offer their services to you. It makes for better public services. This is kind of one of those just feel good kind of thing, kind of slides. But these are things that you should be kind of asking in your own community, like, ask your kids or your grandkids, do you plan on staying around here, or can you not afford to stay here? Or, do you have maybe kids that can't really, leave the nest because they can't afford to leave the nest yet? Or the same for your seniors. Can they afford to stay here? Or maybe they paid off their house, but the tax burden is so high that they might not feel necessarily, they might feel this financial strain of sticking around in your community. These are issues and unfortunately lead to huge changes in a lot of our communities. In fact, for my own self, I grew up in Putnam County and I moved to Albany because I knew that I wouldn't be able to afford to stay in my community. So I was able to achieve the dream of homeownership for cheaper here in the city of Albany. So that's where I went to. And we can go to the next slide. And we're often asked sometimes, does affordable housing deflate your property values? And studies have shown that it's pretty much not generally. However, there are some strategies in your communities that you can use to minimize the negative effects of opposition. And it really begins with good design. And sometimes the terminology affordable housing sometimes strikes fear in the minds of many, but in reality, it can really help stabilize or maybe even help your nearby property values, especially when it's well designed and attractive looking. So sometimes it's going to affordable housing developers and asking them to show what they've done, some of their other work that they've done in other communities. And well-managed properties as well are more likely to have a neutral or positive effect on your surrounding properties. Sometimes in your communities, you might have those like larger, older historic homes that are kind of falling into disrepair. Maybe not so much in Rockland County, but we do see this sometimes in upstate, smaller communities, those really big houses. And, that's an opportunity sometimes for small housing nonprofits or supportive housing agencies can help rehab those homes and then bring them back online. And with that, with the revitalization, the rehab of distressed property for affordable housing is proven beneficial to neighboring home values. Neighbors likely to prefer looking at quality housing over vacant lots or dilapidated buildings. Though even sometimes that has opposition, like here in my own neighborhood, there was a vacant lot. A small local nonprofit was going to put in 9 units of infill housing. It looks exactly like the neighboring communities or the neighboring buildings, and they still had a hard time doing it, but it's almost completed and it looks a lot better than the vacant space with garbage kind of blowing down the street on the open lot. So sometimes the fear, is not necessarily after it happens, you figure out like, hey, this was actually pretty good. And locating housing in neighborhoods with high income and high housing values and low poverty rates are unlikely to have adverse impact on neighboring property values. In fact, they find that if you are near a high scoring public school, housing costs 2.4 times as much, which is roughly $11,000 more a year than housing by a lower performing school. So that's kind of difficult as well. And I think there's a lot of things of people who fear people coming in from other places to live in affordable housing in your community. It's often extremely exaggerated. Often it's just struggling people in your own community that would qualify and would like to stay in their community. And this is a way of allowing them to do so. So with that, I am finally going to take a break here. You've heard enough from me. I'm going to pass it over to Chris, and he's going to give us kind of a quick overview of what, housing history here in the United States.
And I'll try to get through these fairly quickly because they're not the focus of the course, but I think they're important because they give some context for the situation we find ourselves in right now. In recent years, there's been a lot of blame placed on local governments for not zoning more densely for affordable housing, and that's only part of the story. There's a lot more to it than that. And requiring local governments, some might have heard that there was a pretty controversial proposal in the budget, in the state budget, to include a requirement that local governments or a prohibition on local governments prohibiting accessory dwelling units as a means of increasing density and supply for affordable housing, which was very controversial and might not have really helped the problem a whole lot, and had some downsides, and ultimately was not included. So just some history here. In the 19th century, most New York counties had county poor farms and county poor homes where distressed people lived and worked on the farm, and they were mostly single men. And there's still, in some of the counties that I spend time in, Schoharie, Montgomery County. I have friends in Essex County, and the old county poor home is down the road from where they live. Some of those still, the buildings are still there, but they're no longer in operation. But that was something New York State had as a safety net for some of its less fortunate members of society. But the Tenement House Act was enacted in New York State, the New York State Tenement House Act, in 1901, and just had some code requirements, required windows in every room, ventilation, courtyards, and indoor toilets, and other elements just of builders of those types of buildings. In 1937, the first public housing subsidies were passed, and the Federal Housing Administration, founded in 1934, I think. By the 1940s and 50s, there were public housing authorities that were subsidized for building with the plan for the rent of tenants to cover the operation and maintenance of the public housing facilities. So the subsidy was for the building, and the rent was designed to cover the cost of operation and maintenance of these structures. I'm not sure a former colleague of ours called this era the perfect storm of changes. I'm not quite sure why, but there were a number of changes. Anybody interested in planning is very familiar with suburbanization, thanks to subsidies in the form of highways and the mortgage interest deduction. My grandparents bought a house in the town of Orangetown in Rockland County in the 1950s with my grandfather, was a veteran from the GI Bill, with the help of the GI Bill. And for years they had very little money. And I think there was fear. I always hear that they were scared of losing it for years and years before his career kind of stabilized. And that I think they paid something like $12,000 or $15,000 for it, $20,000 at the most. And my grandfather sold that house. It was right next to a freight rail line, and he sold it in about not quite 20 years ago, 15, 16 years ago, for more than I could have afforded, something like $400,000. And it was part of that. It was not a Levittown house, but one of those 1950s split level ranches that are very common in Rockland County. That was when a lot of Rockland was developed, and a lot of suburbs developed in the 1950s and 60s. And so there was a migration out to the suburbs, and urban renewal resulted in the loss of many existing units that might have been somewhat affordable in cities. And there began in mid-century, in the 50s and 60s, the building of public housing in the form of high rises and that brutalist architecture hasn't aged all that well. And soon after their construction, a decline in funding for this type of public housing. And some housing authorities have been really successful. And I've heard lots of stories of people growing up in public housing and having fond memories of it, but that hasn't always been the case. The Taylor apartments in Troy look a little worse than this right now, and they're going to be demolished in the near future. We hear lots of stories of high-rise public housing suffering from lack of maintenance and lack of funding for maybe some of the not so well managed housing authorities, and less funding to support those, less federal funding support to support those authorities. And what happens when buildings with all of these units are demolished? The tenants have to go somewhere, and the general trend has been fewer public housing units being built over most of the 20th century and into the 21st. So the general trend has been from public management of housing to more support of private development of housing. And maybe people think, well, we're letting the market do its work. Well, those subsidies for private developers to build affordable housing have to be pretty high, because developers have to make a profit. And they are not going to be in the business of housing development if they can't make a profit. And developing luxury housing is always profitable. They never lose in developing luxury housing. And so in order to attract private developers of affordable housing, subsidies have to be generous, and they have been less generous in general in recent years. So just quickly here, that you can see the rise and growth of the number of units of public housing. And at sometime in the 80s, they peaked, although already the increase in construction of them had begun to decline. And now into the 90s, the number of units has actually declined while the demand, the need for them has continued to rise. So rent vouchers have have made up an increasing percentage of for subsidies of housing, and the trend has been less in the construction of, as I've said here, of construction of affordable units. A brief history of public housing. Unfortunately, from its start in 1934, the Federal Housing Administration had a history of creating segregated and unequal units. And in 1968, the Fair Housing Act prohibited such discrimination. But for all those years it was taking place, the effects remained for years to come. And in the Nixon administration, the increase in spending on public housing was essentially frozen, and the creation of Section 8 that same year, 1974, saw the creation of Section 8 vouchers, housing vouchers, and we hear about Section 8 housing and Section 8 renters, not always in the most positive light. That is where the federal subsidy for affordable housing has shifted from public housing to Section 8. And the Reagan and Clinton administrations continued policies that eliminated new public housing units. Meanwhile, the existing public housing units continue to be lost. And you see at the bottom of the right side of the page, or the right side of the slide here, 2000 to 2016, 140,000 dilapidated public housing units were demolished in those 16 years. And sometimes we think, okay, we're getting rid of an eyesore and a place that really wasn't fit for anybody to live, but then they weren't replaced. So what happens to those people who are displaced? So one thing that happens to them is that they become homeless. Homelessness was not really a problem until the 1970s. There was not a whole lot of homelessness around the United States, but lower income people have seen since the 1970s till now their buying power diminished, and so lower people of lower income have lost purchasing power, and the deinstitutionalization of the mentally ill has been a huge problem, along with drugs such as crack in the 80s, opioids more recently, and heroin. I would add fentanyl to this list, but somebody told me just this weekend, who works with this population, that people don't get addicted to fentanyl because it's so toxic, it's so potent that they die before they can get addicted. So these are huge problems in our society that have contributed to homelessness. And the result has been of the lack of or diminished public housing is that emergency shelters have taken a lot of the homeless in. Not-for-profit organizations have taken on this cause, or this problem has been shifted to the not-for-profit sector, and faith-based organizations have stepped in. The houses you see in the photo are a stone's throw from our office on Sheridan Avenue in Albany. A friend of mine happened to work on this project. He's an architect who worked for the Interfaith Partnership for the Homeless. And the yellow house is an old house that was empty and abandoned. I believe the red one might be too. See, I can't even tell because they did such a good job designing them and working on them. They look every bit this good. They're very well maintained, and there are multiple units in these buildings, even though they look like the single family homes that were there years ago, traditionally there in that neighborhood. So as Paula said, design has a real impact on how the acceptance of affordable housing in the neighborhood. So a little bit of case law here, and this relates a little more to your jobs as members of planning boards and zoning boards of appeals, and I hope local governing boards. There is limited, and you'll see here, limited ability for zoning regulations, and Paula will get into this further, to require public housing. Their zoning can only do so much to produce public housing, to produce affordable housing, but there are ways in which local governments can make the building cannot get in the way of the building of affordable housing. A definition of exclusionary housing, something that we learn about in planning school, and many of you have probably heard about, is that is the practice of zoning regulations that make the building of affordable housing difficult and all but mandates expensive housing be built. And this is often intentional, but it not always. Sometimes these regulations are in place without being intentional, but in some places they are. So through explicit racial and fiscal, though explicit racial and fiscal zoning is illegal, the practice of exclusionary zoning exists. Exclusionary zoning exists in requirements that make more expensive the housing that is built and exclude options that would be less expensive for lower income tenants and owners. And well-maintained affordable housing, as Paula pointed out in an earlier slide, should not lower the value of nearby properties, but large square footage minimums for the houses to be built, large lot size minimums, and prohibition of multi-unit housing are all contribute to potentially exclusionary housing laws. Federal laws that protect citizens that should guarantee some level of affordability. The U.S. Constitution bars discrimination on race. The Federal Fair Housing Act of 1968 prevents discrimination on race in the sale, rental, or financing of dwellings based on race, religion, gender, national origin, or disability. So, but very importantly, even if there is an overt evidence of discriminatory intent, if the law has the effect, it could be invalidated. So one thing local officials can do is just make sure that their regulations don't do that. Euclid versus Ambler is a landmark case that we talk about often in our courses. It was ruled by the United States Supreme Court in 1926, and it upheld zoning as a legitimate form of the police power. And just a little background, which we don't talk about too much in most of our courses, is that the village of Euclid outside of Cleveland was being consumed by the city of Cleveland. The big city and its larger scale buildings were kind of taking over this quaint village that was a suburb, and it was just being consumed. And to maintain the character and through its height and density, the village of Euclid restricted development to maintain that village scale. And a developer, Ambler Realty, and even apartments were restricted from certain zones. And Ambler Realty claimed that those restrictions were a taking without due process. And the court ultimately said that the loss that the real estate company claimed was speculative, and that those restrictions, zoning restrictions, were a valid, there was a valid government interest in maintaining the character of that neighborhood. A trial court judge said at one point that this tool, this kind of regulation, could result in possible discrimination and protection of character of neighborhoods for some of the wrong reasons. But nevertheless, this case stands as and is referred to and continues to be referred to, has been referred to throughout zoning history as a landmark case upholding the ability to regulate land uses. A famous, nearly as much of a landmark case in affordable housing was Mount Laurel in New Jersey. And we read this in planning school. We read the case and we hear about it in affordable housing circles. In 1975, the New Jersey Supreme Court, and New Jersey's Supreme Court is its highest court, not its lowest court, as in the case of New York. The New Jersey Supreme Court ruled that the zoning in the town of Mount Laurel, which only allowed for single-family residential structures, only allowed for single-family residences and no apartments, nothing other than single-family homes, was exclusionary. And it was limiting it foreclosed opportunities of low and moderate income housing. And the court said the municipality and all local governments in the state must provide their fair share of the regional need for affordable housing. And what is important to understand here is that a challenge is needed to enforce this law, this case law. Mount Laurel 2, another challenge to the same township, was the result of a lack of compliance by the town to really make an effort to rezone some of its land. And this time the court included builder's remedy for developers at the trial court level. And so again, acknowledge the need for a challenge in order to enforce this law. New York State's landmark affordable housing case was Berenson, which was a little less cut and dry and just says that a comprehensive plan must give consideration to regional housing needs. And it's not, even if there's not multifamily housing, and this is in 1975 also, within the municipality, the comprehensive plan can say the need for housing has been satisfied within the region, but the comprehensive plan has to make that case if there isn't multifamily housing, if the town itself or the municipality itself doesn't provide its fair share of housing. So it wasn't saying specifically that every municipality needs to provide its fair share, but subsequent cases have referred back to Berenson and reinterpreted that need for affordable housing. So it remains a landmark housing decision in New York. I'm not going to go through all of these, but just quickly, the Upper Brookville case said that 5-acre minimum lot sizes was not automatically exclusionary. The village made a case for open space protection and provided affordable housing elsewhere and by other means. In the town of North Salem in Westchester County, went back and forth with its provision of affordable housing, changed its zoning in response to a case to provide a more diverse, a diversity of housing options through its zoning, and then changed its zoning back to restrict them. And ultimately, it was the North Salem case that said, that cited Berenson and said every municipality should provide its fair share and shouldn't restrict multifamily housing. Granite Asphalt Products versus the town of Sardinia in Western New York just reiterated that exclusionary zoning in housing was a problem and illegal for local governments to engage in, but restricting mining wasn't exclusionary. Restricting the extraction of natural resources for the protection of the environment was not exclusionary. So I'll turn it back to Paula here.
Excuse me, can I just jump in with a question?
Oh, by all means, Adam.
Sure.
Thanks.
And actually, this kind of goes back, I think, to what Paula was talking about before, but we have a question that says, how can high-level maintenance of affordable housing developments be incentivized? Well-maintained units are less likely to have negative neighborhood impacts, but how can good maintenance be assured?
I would say that's probably a discussion you would want to have about the financing when the project is before you on a board. And then on top of it, sometimes it's doing kind of your like recognizance is like going and seeing what other, if they've, most likely they've been in the business for a while. So you can usually look to other developments to see at one point, did they develop other ones and go to them? And if you see that it's still pretty attractive, I would say that you have probably a better chance of it being maintained for the long haul.
Okay. Well, if I could just jump in a little bit too, I mean, that is also just a question of enforcement of your land use regulations.
Yeah, that's true too.
You have a project that comes before you for a site plan, and as part of that site plan, they presented, landscaping, and you can also have conditions on approvals that say graffiti must be removed and trash must be cleaned up. If a property is not maintained, if the landscaping dies, if graffiti isn't removed, they're in violation of your site plan approval. So that's just one of those ongoing enforcement actions taken on the part of the municipality.
Yeah,
That's right, Adam. Good old fashioned code enforcement.
yeah, and we tend to find I think a lot of people sometimes get a little nervous about having like group homes in their community. Like I said earlier, that's usually a good opportunity if you have any of those pretty large scale projects or like large scale main street homes that you had, with the big porches, and might be a little too much for a single family or maybe a single person, but usually you'll find that they have operating expenses, at least on the side of nonprofit supportive housing agencies, that they're usually pretty good about keeping their communities and their assets looking pretty tidy and trying to work with the neighbors to make everyone happy.
Yeah. Well, just on a personal note, my neighbors to my rear is a group home for disabled adults, and they're ideal neighbors.
Yeah.
They're great. So.
Yeah, my cousin's actually waiting for a spot in a group home for autistic women in Rockland County at the moment. So, so it's an important service to have in your community, and often they stick to themselves and they can be excellent neighbors. So now we're going to turn and look at local land use tools and strategies that we can use to try to encourage affordability in your communities. So we can go to the next slide. So of course we always, because we're what I like to call plan nerds, we always start with the comprehensive plan. It's the heart of all planning and land use activities in your community. It's your expression of your municipality's goals and recommended achievement to achieve those goals, and it should provide an outline for your orderly growth and providing continued guidance for decision making. We always like to see that it's a plan that's always being looked at, especially if you're on a planning or a zoning board, you're going back to it, you're seeing what's trying to move towards those goals, you're kind of always looking at it when you're making decisions to see, like, does this fit in? If it doesn't, what can you do to try to make a project fit in a little bit better? And again, it's always a good place to start. And often, as Chris has now told you, that you have to take a look at the regional housing needs thanks to that Berenson case. Usually there is a section on housing. There might be a whole subsection of a report on housing needs assessments in your community. So it's always good to take a kind of an inventory of the existing conditions in your community, and kind of can help you kind of determine what your future housing needs are going to be. And that includes looking at things like your current demographics. Are you an aging community? Do you have a lot of young families? Do you have students? Is that going to be an impact for your local schools? What the existing housing is in your community. Maybe you are like a bedroom community and a lot of it was developed in the 1980s, 1990s, and maybe early 2000s. So you might have pretty good housing that doesn't need a lot of work because it's relatively new. You might also be in a community that's maybe has older housing. You need to know the age and the conditions. And of course, take a look at the financials, what housing prices are going for now, what your rental prices are in your community, how many rentals you do have. Take a look at your cost burden analysis for everyone and try to make an assessment of the need for your current housing as well as your future. Again, ask those kids and seniors if they can afford to stay. Is your housing safe for people of all ages to be able to live safely throughout their entire lives? There's like a now safe housing from cradle to grave. That's kind of a new terminology in the industry about trying to build livable places. We can go to the next slide. So here are some comprehensive planning examples, including your neighbors to the north in Orange County, encouraging the provision of a wide spectrum of housing types and choices, including affordable housing and providing options for rural, suburban, and urban living. And it should include housing at a range of density styles and owner and renter types. And then down on Long Island, we see creation of planned residential communities providing an array of housing to meeting social and economic needs of the residents of the hamlets, the town, and the region. And providing the opportunity for affordable housing for senior citizens aged 55 years and older. I think my parents in their mid 60s would probably scoff at that because they consider themselves young 65-year-olds. We can move to the next slide. So probably the most common zoning tool we see being used currently in, or at least trying to encourage affordable housing in your community, is inclusionary housing and inclusionary zoning. And essentially here, the developer, there's requirements for affordable housing. And essentially they can either build those units in whatever project is before you. You can build those units offsite or maybe contribute cash or land in lieu of construction for the creation of affordable housing. We always say the best practice here is to provide a couple different methods of compliance to avoid any constitutional vulnerabilities. This usually, we're seeing this kind of getting adopted in a lot more communities now. It usually works better in communities with a stronger real estate market. But the next slide will tell us a little bit more about what it includes. So it usually works, the typical mandatory inclusionary regulation, so your zoning law locally will tell you what the size and threshold of developments. So sometimes that's often as few as 5 5 to 30 units. Sometimes it's also a percentage set aside. I think here in the city of Albany, it's every project that's over, I think 25 has to have a 5% set aside. You'll also usually include the income range defined as area median income from below 30% to as high as 130% AMI. Remember, those 30% are the hardest to house because they're making so little that you have to really offset it with the subsidies of construction to be able to not only pay for it up front, but also maintain it over the course of the compliance period. 130% AMI is really considered like workforce housing and more towards, like, I would say, blue collar middle income housing. And again, the percentage of affordable units required to be set aside, again, sometimes it's 5 to 25% or more. We see usually bigger in places like Manhattan, but in suburban communities, we usually see 15 to 20%. Sometimes in urban areas, if it's a softer market, it's sometimes 5%. And the trade-off, of course, is you can lower the percentage for very low income units. So those 30% AMI units, you might say, okay, if you provide 5% of that, but maybe it would be 15% for 120% AMI. Then there's the unit design and side standards. You want similar design features and size and bedrooms as the market rates. You're going to have sometimes people are going to try to get around the requirement by saying, sure, we'll set aside things, but we'll set aside like 5 studio apartments and the rest of the development is 2 and 3 bedroom apartments. You want something pretty similar to what else is being out there. And of course, the unit and layout and placement, are they going to be dispersed throughout the subdivision or the project or site plan, or are they isolated? This is where we try to say there was an issue a couple years ago in New York City where we had the concept of the pour door, where they put the inclusionary housing requirements had a separate door from everybody else, which is, kind of classist, I think. So you want to try to avoid things like that. The time frame, are the units going to be built at the same time as all the other ones, or is the developer going to come back later and build those units at the end? And then, of course, whatever controls you're going to have to ensure that the units remain affordable, you need to specify that period, the compliance period. There's usually, if they're using subsidies from affordable housing programs, there already is a compliance period. Usually the more money that's going into it, the longer the compliance period. So sometimes we see 30 to 40 years. And we do that through deed restrictions and covenants as well. So,
Paula,
yes.
we have a question. What do you mean by constitutional vulnerability? Could you expand on that a little?
So you want to essentially allow for, you don't want to make it your set aside so strict that there's only one way in which they can do it, or they can like hold up their end of the requirement. So things like that is, and on that slide, we had a couple different things. So one, they could construct and build those units themselves, or they can provide it off-site. So not necessarily on whatever they're working, but they say, okay, since we know that this is a requirement, we don't have the space to do it on site, but there is there's a place across town where we would be able to build maybe 9 units of affordable housing. Would that work? Or contributing cash or land in lieu of construction is another popular way of doing it, so that the developer doesn't necessarily have to do it. However, that you're giving them enough flexibility to provide for the intent of the law elsewhere. So I think we're saying there, like, it's sometimes hard, the more constrained you make your local law is sometimes the ability for people to challenge it more. And I think that's where we're talking about avoiding the constitutional vulnerability.
Yeah, you're saying if there's just one or very limited ways of compliance, you're effective. It's like when you effectively prohibit something by
Yes.
placing enough restrictions on it. I'm just going to toss this out there. Maybe you're going to address it in a little while, but maybe I'm jumping ahead. But since the notion of being flexible came up, I thought of this. Another method of getting this is also not just having a baseline percentage of affordable units, but by creating incentives for zoning, meaning, by increasing the percentages of affordable units, you might get an FAR bonus or a height bonus.
You were literally talking about the next slide.
Oh, sorry, I stole your thunder.
No, it's fine. But that is essentially what you're doing. You want it to be flexible, where you're essentially allowing people to have the incentive to try to allow the developer to still make money, but you're still on the municipal side, still getting something for it. So we can kind of go to the next slide here. Essentially, you're offering your incentives and you're trying to, reduce the developer costs so that you end up getting more out of it. So some of the incentives that we'll see in zoning is like giving a density bonus. So they can have an extra floor if they're going to offer, 5% of those units to be, affordable. You might also give them zoning setbacks in terms of like area variances and allowing them to develop a little bit more, as well as height and bulk bonuses. And sometimes they'll offer open space, or you'll get open space for it, or maybe you have something that says like you have to provide X number of, recreational facilities as part of this, but maybe you'll give them a break on that instead. And another common one that we see is parking space reductions. Especially if you're seeing these developments go into places with a walkable downtown. The idea there is, or it's around transit. We see a lot of transit oriented development happening, maybe not so much in Rockland County, but we do see it currently occurring around all of the Metro North stations on the eastern side of the river. We also see it along the Long Island railroads in Long Island, where affordability is a serious problem there too. Whereas you might not necessarily need a car if you're in a place where you can kind of get around without having to do that. A lot of times we also see developers striking deals with local transit authorities. We see that here in the capital region. So people who rent there get like a bus pass to be able to get around. That further helps the need for parking. And another big one is expedited permitting, allowing the process to go a little bit faster so that, time is money and the developer gets to kind of go full steam ahead without necessarily having to, jump through all of the hoops that sometimes you have to. And then, of course, some of the offsets here is trying to reduce the development costs. Maybe you waive some of your permit fees or sewer hookup fees, or offer some kind of infrastructure subsidy. And then, of course, the developer in turn, might get a tax abatement, or it might reduce the carrying cost to the future low income owner, allowing the developer to charge upfront a little bit more for the units. And then, of course, there's capital subsidies, which are often part of these deals, where you get it from the home program or from a state or local housing trust fund. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple of slides. So, of course, inclusionary zoning, it might work in your community. It might be great. Maybe your community is totally about it. But there are a lot of communities that are sometimes a little hesitant to do that, especially if they have a softer real estate market. So another tool you could use is doing a voluntary inclusionary zoning, where it's not mandatory. And of course, here, some of the pros is, you might end up with less community opposition to it, but of course, it might not be as effective as a mandatory program. And some of the incentives and change for the affordable housing units include zoning waivers in exchange for identified amenities. Again, that's usually all of your set aside. Sometimes it's open space, sometimes it's, open space is the one that keeps coming up to my mind. And then incentives, of course, can be based on a sliding scale based on the percentage of affordability and levels of affordability. So if they're doing it for a lower income, so let's say 50 to 80% AMI, maybe you give them a little bit more since, it costs more to do that type of housing as compared to like 80% AMI or more. But it seems common that we're seeing 80% AMI typically in inclusionary zoning, I think is pretty common at this point. And we can now turn to workforce housing. And we'll talk about Long Island in this one. And this is affordable housing for households with earned income insufficient to secure quality housing within reasonable proximity to the workplace. Again, this is targeting all of your essential workers, the people that we called heroes in the pandemic, your service workers, your nurses, teachers, firemen, cops, the people that might not necessarily be able to afford to live in your community with the current, with their current salaries. So there's a more expanded understanding of affordable housing. I think sometimes workforce housing is maybe not as controversial as a term as affordable housing can sometimes be. And these are often units for the gainfully employed who drive until they qualify. So a lot of times in the past, we saw this where people work in the city and then they drive to Westchester and they're in northern Westchester, and they just keep driving until they can finally find a place that they can live. So I think we've gobbled up all of Westchester County. We've probably gobbled up most of Putnam County now. And I think Dutchess County is probably where it's at now, where people keep driving until they can find a place. And the definitions for workforce housing usually range between 50 to 120% of the area median income. And we often, like I said earlier, see some of this sometimes in more tourist, places like Lake Placid, again, would be a good example of this. Whereas, people can't really afford to live there. They have to drive many miles to get there. And that's, of course, puts a strain on the rest of your, especially if they're first responders, on the rest of your communities. And we see this with some of my other colleagues have been seeing more of this of, volunteerism, and a lot of these services are based in volunteerism. You might not necessarily be able to find volunteer firefighters to, be able to help provide that kind of service in your community if they can't afford to live there. So I think sometimes we fail to sometimes think of the bigger picture there, that, the younger people that you would rely on to do that often maybe can't, answer the call even though they'd want to. So the next slide is the Long Island Workforce Housing Program. This was passed in 2008 in Nassau and Suffolk counties. And this is for applications to build 5 or more residential units. The developer will get a 10% density bonus. And then the local governments require one of the following: at least 10% of affordable workforce housing units set aside in the development for households at or below 120% of median income, or constructions of the units on site or within the municipality, or a fee payment for each unit required to build. The fee shall be equal to 2 times the median income for a family of 4 on Long Island. So that's actually pretty high. It's worked with the Long Island Housing Partnership, and 50% of that pot of money ends up being used for a revolving loan fund to provide down payment assistance to qualified home buyers who are looking to be part of some of the employer assistance housing benefits with some of the bigger employers in the community. or it requires that or they can build rental units for it elsewhere in the community. So I think Long Island Housing Partnership, as of right now, I think has 650 rental units and 30 developments across Long Island. So it's a step in the right direction. It probably has some critics, but it's at least an idea of trying to get people to be able to live more comfortably on Long Island, which is, pretty difficult. And they definitely have a youth housing or a youth crisis on their hands down there. We can go to the next slide.
Oh,
So
do you have a sense of the fee payment for the units if the partnership?
At this point, it's probably maybe in the 400,000 to 500,000 is my guess.
Oh, wow.
It's probably pretty high.
Mhm.
Paula, just the Long Island program. I mean, how did this come to pass? I mean, how was this coordinated across multiple municipalities in 2 counties?
So I think what happened was they realized that they had a crisis on their hands and they were like, okay, we need to figure out something. So it ended up, I think it's all done through intermunicipal partnerships and agreements. And I think the Long Island Community Foundation also played a role in it as well, bringing kind of everybody together to think a little bit more about what we can do. And of course, there's the Long Island Housing Partnership, which is, a kind of a well-known housing agency down there. So I think it was also probably, I believe there was state support for it as well, getting it first set up, but it's essentially kind of like a housing revolving trust fund, which could be something that we could see in other places as well. It would be interesting if we could see something like this in maybe like Rockland and Orange County, if you could come together and figure out something like that. But yeah, I think I don't know exactly how it was because I wasn't involved in it when it was first coming around. So
Okay.
I could take a look if you have more questions though.
All right, there was a question that was posed. I think I kind of covers. I think the question was, how does Long Island overcome home rule, i.e. how they enforce the zoning regulation on local municipalities? I think you answered that fairly well from my question. So I'm just going to say that we've answered that and move on.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is we're at a point there in their communities where they've realized that this is a problem, so we need to provide it somewhere in our community. Of course, you try to do the best you can with the opposition to it, but I think people are coming around to it because they realize like it's pretty surprising when, your grandkids can't afford to live there. Sometimes people's opinions, change. What might not have been a problem for them 20 years ago is now a problem. So I think attitudes are slowly changing.
So they've signed on voluntarily,
Yeah.
those towns and villages that have participated.
So quickly moving on, we have cluster development and conservation subdivision. So this is for more new construction. Your planning board needs authorization to do so. Comes from state statute. And your zoning would designate what districts where you're allowing for it. Essentially what you're doing is you're taking a traditional development in their traditional development numbers, but you're developing the housing closer together or clustered together to kind of cut down on infrastructure costs. So there's less sewage, water, piping that needs to get put down, less road. So there's less costs overall. The density essentially increases, but not above what's normally allowed by zoning. So there's maybe less opposition to it as well. And it kind of makes for a better sense of community. And we can go to the next slide. We have what I think is kind of the darling of affordable housing at the moment is the accessory dwelling units. Which is usually a second residential unit contained within a single family home or garage, also known as the in-law apartments. Sometimes we see these illegally in a lot of places, especially, I hate to keep going back to Long Island, but Long Island's well known for having serious not affordability issues and then serious problem with illegal apartments as well. People living, in garages that aren't up to code, things like that. So the accessible dwelling unit can be a way of kind of putting cost-effective affordable housing. A lot of times, we call these the in-law apartments, where it allows for intergenerational housing like we've done many times in the past. And it's a complete living unit space that's been built essentially into a single family home, or maybe around a single family home. Like sometimes it's in the backyard, or maybe it's attached to the garage or something. It can be done a little bit differently in every community. We can go to the next slide. This is actually a hot topic in California because they implemented a state level ADU laws to make it cheaper, faster, and easier to develop ADUs in their communities. For them, they don't require owner occupancy, and it kind of got around homeowners associations because their restrictions are now overruled. They ease lot size and setback requirements. I think this is where a lot of the opposition sometimes comes from, because they're not quite sure what that means. In every community, it might be a little bit different. There's more financial aid available to owners that are willing to put these on their property. There's faster and easier permitting and reduced parking requirements. Chris mentioned this earlier. This was a thought process in the New York State budget process. It's not always popular, but it can be sometimes a quick way of being able to legitimize illegal apartments that are already flying under the radar. And sometimes they can be a relatively minor impact in some communities. I think of things like in like more wealthier communities, they might sort of already exist if you have like a caretaker house on the property anyway. But again, it's something that I would suggest that we'll probably see more of in the future. And then back over to Chris to talk about manufactured housing.
So from accessory dwelling units in California, those ADUs look pretty expensive to me in those photos, but the to manufactured housing in upstate New York, manufactured housing is the largest source of unsubsidized affordable housing. And there are different levels of regulation. We won't get into that for the purposes of this course, but we just want to make the point that it used to be that local governments could not zone out manufactured housing. They had to provide for some location for manufactured housing. There was a change in executive law a few years ago that said that manufactured housing could not be discriminated against if it was on a permanent foundation, and it had to be treated as site-built housing. And we haven't had many calls about this law. There wasn't a whole lot of news around it, but I suspect that part of the reason is because those local governments that are more inclined to allow manufactured housing or have fewer regulations that wouldn't restrict manufactured housing don't have a problem with it. They allow it. Some of the more rural municipalities across the state, and those that might restrict it further are more expensive, and the land costs are so high that those who can afford the land are likely to not put a manufactured home on it. The manufactured home parks also can't be discriminated against. They're regulated by they need permits from the Department of Health for water and wastewater, and they should be treated from a zoning standpoint as single family residences like any other, and again, not discriminated against and not held to a higher standard than single family residential, site-built single family residential housing. So this change in executive law includes that that requirement. So those laws could be challenged and overridden if there are laws, and there are laws out there. We get calls about them all the time that still have discriminatory language toward manufactured housing. Senior housing is another hot topic. It's been in New York for a number of years, and it's building it is generally less controversial. And there has been a pretty high profile state initiative by the Office for the Aging at the state and the AARP. There are lots of reasons, property taxes and energy costs, as well as accessibility needs for aging populations to want to move out of their longtime residences, but not necessarily move out of the community. And there are not many places for them. There's kind of a shortage of places for them to go. So ADUs are a good option for them, in-law apartments, or as well, those accessory apartments within single-family residences, and general flexibility in zoning to allow for the development of senior housing in the form of overlays or floating zones. For overlays, senior housing would be permitted in certain locations. For floating zones, they might not necessarily have a zone for them, but the municipality would have the goal of providing senior housing in its zoning, and a developer of senior housing would approach the local governing board and ask for that zoning to be applied to a certain property, and it would be something similar to a planned unit development, and the law written into place for that, or applied, the floating zone applied to a certain location. Missing middle housing is a term that we're hearing a lot in the last few years, in the last couple of years, and I love that the photo here is of a really beautiful historic building, because that really says what missing middle is. It's those multi-unit residential buildings that aren't single family, aren't two family, and aren't large high-rise apartment buildings. And the reason they're missing is because they weren't legal to build in most zoning districts, most suburban zoning districts, and the suburban zoning that was applied to even urban neighborhoods. And form-based zoning can highly encourage their development. There are lots of these missing middle housing units existing. I saw a really good example of them a couple of years ago when I had some car problems outside of the city of Binghamton, or just on the outskirts of Binghamton, right, not far from the downtown, on a major east-west road. The buildings at the ends of the streets were very much like these, and they were very nice buildings. They were high quality construction. Many of them were at least partially vacant, unfortunately, and commercial uses had kind of infiltrated that, what might have been a former primarily residential zone, and more heavy commercial and auto commercial uses, where the single family residences were on the side streets. But it was almost like I could see how it was almost like a textbook plan. But form-based zoning, which prescribes the form and is more relaxed in the actual use, form-based zoning could require as well multi-unit residences that look like one or two family residences, for example. That might be easier for certain municipalities to accept. Naturally occurring affordable housing is those places that are just less expensive to live, that don't have any public subsidy to lower income households. And those are what we used to call starter homes. And I know of a lot of very modest houses in good school districts that are no longer starter homes. Friends of mine live in places like this, and they get, people buy those houses a lot of the time and tear them down and build new. And in some ways, these units could be protected with one tool that most people don't think of to protect neighborhoods like this are local historic districts. My sister happens to live in one in Princeton, New Jersey, where the real estate values were so high that there was a trend toward tear downs. And when the city, or the I guess it's the township, passed a local historic district, speculation, because the value of the property became less because the smaller, more modest houses couldn't be torn down, that kind of cooled off speculation. But some strategies to preserve naturally occurring affordable housing include partnering with housing agencies, community loan funds, and other not-for-profits to keep locals in these houses and these residences, and to support local mom and pop style landlords. Just an example of affordable housing in the State Environmental Quality Review Act, in the environmental assessment form, the full EAF, there is a question about the proposed action, whether the proposed action would displace affordable or low-income housing in an area where there is a shortage of such housing. So the state has long had an acknowledgement of the need to preserve affordable housing in whatever land use questions we can ask to keep it there. And just a final point on my last slide before I turn it back to Paula is that the housing boards and regional planning commissions are bodies of local officials and professional planners who can provide information about the housing needs, about the housing market, to their local governments to act on. And I won't say any more about that. There's a lot on this slide, but I know we're running a little tight on time here.
Yeah, we actually have a couple of interesting questions that have come in and comments on the chat as well. And I'm just gonna touch on the ADU issue. One person mentioned that it's not easy to see how ADUs would help with affordable housing unless they're regulated as affordable, and they could also be subjected to abuse as short-term rentals, which we totally agree with. In fact, we were having that discussion when that legislation was proposed. I think it would take really robust regulations on the side. Maybe it's a permitting system that, municipalities might be able to put in place to try to keep it from becoming the next Airbnb down the street from you. And another comment was ADUs are concerned to the Rockland code enforcement officials. There isn't enough personnel to oversee zoning and building code requirements. And we totally understand from that as well.
That too.
This is especially harder when, I think nonprofits and governments are often told to do more with less. And our code enforcement officials are an aging group as well that's slowly finding their way into retirement, which is kind of increasing the pinch. But there might be opportunities there to try to maybe focus it more on the county side. We see countywide code enforcement in some of the upstate counties. That seems to be working pretty well. But that could be a way there. But those are concerns that we often have as well.
I could just make a comment.
Sure.
The ADUs, helping them be affordable. I mean, well, one, it's an expansion of just the housing stock, where there was one unit, now there's two. Also, if you have a source of income for seniors who might age in place, that's a common argument for ADUs. They have a big house, they don't need all that space, they make an ADU, and now they have assistance financially in terms of paying the mortgage.
And we're starting to see source of income rents laws being implemented in some places as well to try to keep affordability down. So at the end of your lease term, you can't, require more than 5 to 10% on the next lease term to try to keep affordability. We have yet to see real long-term impacts of that, but I believe they were toying with that idea here in Albany. So Maybe in a couple of years, we'll have better opportunities here to try to increase affordability using some interesting legislation. So quickly, we'll just go over some of the funding programs that you often hear about when maybe an affordable housing project comes before you or your board. We can go to the next slide. We'll start with the Housing Choice Voucher Program. Founded in 1974, it's originally known as what people call Section 8 vouchers. They provide vouchers to beneficiaries that covers enough that people only have to pay 30% of their income on housing. The subsidy is paid directly to the landlord by the public housing agency. So it's kind of guaranteed money for the side of the landlord. There's only a limited number of vouchers nationwide. It's 2.2 million. It's often estimates that less than a quarter of those who qualify actually receive assistance, and it is notorious for very long waiting lists that are often 10 to 20 or sometimes even longer, years long. And the unfortunate kind of drawback of this is the recipient only has 2 to 4 months to find housing, and if they don't, then they lose the voucher. So in a lot of communities, people will have these, but they actually struggle to still find housing, and then they end up losing the voucher anyway. So it's not, unfortunately, it's still not a perfect system. We can go to the next slide. The big one that most people talk about is the low-income housing tax credit, also known as LIHTC. It's the biggest federal program for the creation of affordable housing. As Chris mentioned, the federal government got out of the business of providing the housing. Instead, we've really pushed towards the private sector to provide that housing for us. So if a development project meets the criteria set by the New York State for housing affordability, they can apply for a tax credit. Then those tax credits are sold to investors, people like banks, for cash that they can then use to build the housing and maintain the housing. There's about 100 billion in private capital has been leveraged through the credits since 1986. We can go to the next slide. So there's two different types of tax credits in New York State. There's the 9% new construction credit. It's extremely competitive. It allows the developer to claim about 9% of the project's qualified costs every year for 10 years. If it's in a dire area for housing, the credit can increase to 30%, but there's also concern that that means that you're basically encouraging further segregation by putting all of these places in lower income, high poverty areas, which typically end up being in urban areas. And the credits usually cover about 60 to 70% of new housing construction or renovation costs. And then there's the 4%, which is less competitive. They can claim some deductions based on the depreciation and losses on the project that then are further reduced to their income tax burden. The next slide. So of course, there's drawbacks. In the Great Recession. Essentially, LIHTC kind of screeched to a halt, fell by almost 50% from 116,000 units being built in 2004 to just over 61,000 units in 2010. We go back to Chris again. Remember that chart showed that we keep losing public housing units, which means if we can't build new, we just keep losing. It's mostly recovered, but it was still behind, and then COVID happened, so we're probably well behind at that point as well. Reducing corporate income taxes also reduces the value of the incentive to invest in tax credits like LIHTC. So it means essentially that less affordable housing or less affordable homes are built. So that was a consideration in the last administration when we saw an overhaul of the tax code. And after the compliance period, the buildings can be sold and converted to market rate housing. So after 30 or 40 years, if you're living in a hot enough market, a private developer might come in and buy the housing, might buy it and then convert it to market rates. So then you're losing even more subsidized housing. We can go to the next slide. We also see the HOME program. It's a federal program that then gets sent to New York State to spend. The goal here is to acquire, rehabilitate, and construct affordable housing or provide assistance to low-income home buyers and renters. The period of affordability, the compliance period, is usually 5 to 20 years. And this is for local governments, nonprofits, public housing authorities, and community development organizations. These tend to be a little bit more smaller scale. We see a lot more of these in upstate New York, where LIHTC might not necessarily be as marketable in more rural places. And of course, it's administered by the New York Housing Trust Fund Corporation. And that's housed at the New York State Housing and Community Renewal, HCR. We can go to the next slide. Then there's everybody's favorite Community Development Block Grants, CDBG. They provide financial assistance for municipalities to develop affordable housing and expand economic opportunities. So there's an economic development aspect to it. 3 types of housing projects in New York State are eligible for this funding. It's housing rehab. I see it's spelled as hosing rehab, so I gotta fix that. Homebuyer down payment assistance, and private water wastewater system assistance. And 70% of the funds have to benefit low and moderate income people. And the next slide. We're running out of time. Quickly, the next slide, we will just kind of give you an idea of what this looks like when somebody goes ahead and starts it. Next slide, Chris. Okay, so usually you start with a project concept. You have to raise your pre-development funds, hire your development team, or you might have it on staff already. Site control, preparing your preliminary designs, and going before land use boards. That's usually you guys, as well as figuring out your financing options. And then if you need any land use approval, that's what they're busy doing, and trying to keep the opposition from getting you down, obtaining your land use approvals, bidding the project, hiring your construction team, starting the construction, as well as usually closing on your finance all at around the same time. So a lot of balls in the air to juggle. Next slide. And then your principal site selection criteria. This is just looking at things to try to make it fit in. So you want to, of course, from the developer perspective, know what the zoning is, figure out the market and what's going to sell in their community. They're going to need infrastructure, what environmental constraints are there, if it's suitable. You don't want to necessarily put these things out in the middle of nowhere if they're not close to public transportation, jobs, or services. Compatibility with your surrounding uses, as well as any other constraints. So these are just a couple of questions you can look through. I'm not going to go over all of them. Next slide. So again, it's just kind of asking yourself questions, are this figuring out where you're going to put it, designing it for your target group. Is it going to be for, multifamily? Is it going to be for seniors? Is it going to be for workforce housing, etc.? What design features you can afford to build. Of course, there's always that balance. You want to promise the world, but there's the reality of money. And then what types of housing you're going to build. Is it going to be low rise or garden apartments? Are you going to incorporate universal design into it? Are you going to rehab an old building, etc.? So next slide. And then Chris, I think you'll walk us through this last couple slides here.
Yep, I'll do a couple of these here, and then you're going to wrap up. I'll just say here that I'm going to replace that photo, and I think the principal was spelled, we had the wrong principal a couple slides ago, and it's been like that. I forgot, I missed it this time. I caught it another time and forgot to switch it. I'm going to switch this photo, and I'm going to put a high-rise apartment building with a bunch of lights out, because we want to make the point that the affordability and vitality go hand in hand. If you have a bunch of luxury buildings and regular people can't live there anymore, then your neighborhood will become less vital. There'll be a lack of street life, as some places in Manhattan Small businesses won't be able to survive. They won't have employees. They won't have customers because not enough people. It's like the Yogi Berra line. It's so expensive that nobody can afford to live there anymore. There are neighborhoods like that that they're becoming. But as we've made the point multiple times, the supply of affordable housing is shrinking and the demand is increasing. Land is scarce, especially in really desirable areas, places where people want to be, good school districts and cool cities and so forth. And the financialization of housing has really contributed to these problems. The Big Short, a movie about subprime mortgages and lending tools that got out of hand, that contributed to the Great Recession. Paula talked about corporate landlords and the impact short-term rentals have had on the long-term rental market. To overcome opposition about affordable housing, maybe use the term workforce housing and diminish the stigma that affordable housing has. It shouldn't have a stigma because many Americans struggle with affordability and aren't eligible for assistance. Personal stories of those who have used and who have lived in affordable housing and have had good experiences with it and have needed it at different types, at different points in their lives. And is the housing that's being proposed proximate to public transit? Does every unit need 1 or 2 parking spots? If not, as in one example in San Francisco, the developer said every parking spot was a unit that wasn't getting built. So can zoning be made simpler and easier for affordable units to be constructed? And I'll stop by just echoing something that Don Elliott said a couple of years ago. I think it was in 2020 that Adam and Arlene had Don Elliott speak to the Federation, and a planner from kind of a celebrity planner with Clarion Planning from Denver, Colorado. He spoke about rezoning commercial areas, underutilized commercial areas for residential uses. There's so much focus on densifying already zoned residential areas. And Don Elliott said, most municipalities zone way too much land for commercial because they want the tax revenue, even if it's not coming. It's like, if they zone it that way, they're going to get the tax revenue. And he made the case that, and we've seen a lot of vacancy in commercial office and retail spaces that can be rezoned for residential, and the density can be potentially built there. So I will turn the last few slides to Paula to wrap up here.
So of course here, as we kept talking through, housing preservation, of course, is a serious issue. And of course, the greenest building is one that we don't demolish. So of course, you're trying to prevent the loss of existing affordable housing. It's difficult in some places, like if their compliance period is over and your market's hot enough, a private developer might just buy in, and unfortunately there goes all those units. I think this is sometimes a discussion that needs to be taking place more on a state and federal level as well. There are some tools that you can use, like spatial mapping programs, to have an idea of what exists where and what you can try to do to encourage preservation, as well as like keeping people in your communities as part of your community. Sometimes people use preservation compacts as a collaborative approach to affordable rental housing, analyzing your data for at-risk properties, and facilitating partnerships across levels of government to reduce costs. A big one, this is hard because a lot of local governments don't want to be in the business of doing housing because they're just not subject matter experts. So there often is affordable housing, advocates that are out there, or small neighborhood-based groups like neighborhood preservation companies and rural preservation companies, and those can be really good partners to have this conversation with and try. A lot of times you make them more competitive if you're just send letters of support with their applications for financing and for competing for what limited federal funding that's out there. We can go to the next slide. So what can local governments do to help? You want to take a look at your local housing data to figure out it's probably a problem in your community, but how much of a problem is it? Are there any ways that we can try to make it easier for the development of affordable housing? This might be giving bonuses or density bonuses to developers. It might be trying to include inclusionary zoning, things like that. Of course, a lot of it is educating the public, and it's also educating your local officials as well. You want to adjust your regional housing needs in your comprehensive plan, but continue having that dialogue about the local need. Again, can your young adults stick around, or your aging seniors? Do they retire and then sell their property and move out of state? We see a lot of that happening right now in New York. Examine any local housing needs and think about ways to enhance it, and engage in public-private partnerships when you can. Sometimes this is easier said than done, but again, those local nonprofits can sometimes be really helpful. So engage them, figure out who's in your community and kind of rally the troops and support around it. Next slide is just quickly our conclusions. I'm sorry, we're about 10 minutes over, but address your housing needs in your comprehensive plan. Keep educating your public officials as well as your fellow residents and constituencies. We want to encourage inclusionary housing policies. Like a lot of times in that one slide about trying to deal with the opposition, a lot of times like people are really hyped up and very anxious about people from the outside coming into your community. But a lot of times like you'll hear from the very vocal minority who are outraged about something, but there might actually be a really large but quieter group of supporters. So sometimes getting out there and being creative in that. I've seen like one of the nonprofits in Boston actually had one person who kept like opposing them. So they actually did a neighborhood survey, and then they actually did an ad in the local paper to garner support to show that it wasn't, there's actually more support for it there than not. So sometimes it's being creative using like social media and things like that. Promote a variety of housing types and sizes and universal design, allowing people to live there cradle to grave. Try to use your land use tools to attain any of your goals. Consider addressing in your zoning. Foster regional partnerships and equality. That's talking to your neighbors, because most likely whatever's happening in your community, if it's a crisis there, it's probably across the borders as well. And partner with your housing experts in your community. So thank you for sticking it out with us. There are a bunch of resources. There's HUD and New York Homes and Community Renewal, which is the housing agency of New York State. For manufactured housing, there's some information there, as well as a mobile home replacements program. There's senior housing opportunities there, as well as 2 model laws from DOS if you want to consider writing that into your zoning regulations. And these are some of the nonprofit people you can turn to if you have questions or need some resources in your community. And finally, that's how you reach us. You don't have to reach out to us about necessarily housing, but you're always welcome to reach out to us about any land use activity that you might have a question about. There's never a dumb question to ask. So we are a resource for local governing officials. So if you have questions or comments or just want to hash something out, feel free to always reach out to us. We're here to assist you. We know your job is not always the easiest to do. So with that, Chris, is there any last things that you want to put in there? I think we answered all the questions.
Well, there was one question, and I feel bad about it now because I said maybe we should save it towards the end. So we're a little late, but I'll ask it. someone asked, so what can we do short-term and longer-term strategies should we develop to keep our youth and seniors so our community stays whole?
Yeah, that's like kind of the $1,000,000 question. So,
Yeah.
so that's where I would say it's more of a comprehensive look at trying to encourage more affordable housing to be developed in your community, because your seniors and your youth would probably qualify to live in those, which would also help in terms of the opposition of people who are like maybe fearful of people from the outside coming to live there. Sometimes it's in a meeting, it's the senior, grandmother figure who stands up and says, actually, it would end up being, I would qualify to live there. So I think it's having that conversation, starting with your comprehensive plan, figuring out where you're going to go in the future. But I think we're going to have to also see a lot of like policy shifts, not necessarily that local governments can really get into, but on the state and the federal side as well, because this is clearly becoming more of an issue, not just in Rockland County, but it's everywhere in New York State. It's starting to become a serious problem everywhere across the United States as well. So, and I feel like we don't really, as a society, have that much of a conversation about housing in general. So I'm hoping as things get maybe a little more dire, which is not a great thing, we'll take these things kind of a bit more seriously. But it's hard because local opposition often can tank a project to a point where developers will say like their projects are more expensive because they have to factor in the fact that they're probably going to be slapped with a Article 78 as part of the process. So, so it sometimes can be kind of disheartening from I think the perspective of that side of the industry, because you're not always necessarily welcome in your community. And I think a lot of it is just having a conversation and being open about it. But having to have that open dialogue is sometimes difficult to do. So, on the side of developers, often they're willing to work with you, they're willing to talk, they're willing to, provide the best that they can possibly provide to your community. You just have to have that open dialogue and be kind of open-minded to them.
And in the meantime, just make sure your zoning regulations allow for these things in your comprehensive plan. Identify where affordable housing developments and multi-unit developments can occur, so that there is a low barrier, that there's a clear message. And form-based zoning is another. We didn't talk a whole lot about form-based zoning, but that is, if there's a form-based zone where there's limited, it's less discretion over the development. A form-based zone built into that comes out of the comprehensive plan, written right into the zoning, where there's very limited, if the developer builds what is basically designed already, the review process will be expedited.
Yeah, trying to figure out trying to diversify in a lot of communities. Like we said, the missing middle is there because of the fact that they only allow for single family residential development. But you might have places in your community where, multifamily would make sense and would be at least a step in the right direction. So you could possibly start thinking more theoretically about that. The missing middle people are pretty, there's actually a book, and I think the author started kind of a design team on trying to retrofit your single family residential areas, if they're kind of walkable, to figure out ways in which you can kind of densify it a little bit within the existing urban or community fabric. So there might be ways to be kind of creative in that regard too. No simple solutions, like I said at the begining. Unfortunately, I can't solve the entire problem. And it's hard when it's the market that kind of, the market is so crazy that it's it's hard to sometimes keep up for the policymakers to try to stay a little bit ahead of the curve. It's difficult.
That's for sure.
All right, well, I mean, there were some questions that I see, Paula, you typed some answers to. I don't know, given the time, if we should go over them. I also just want to bring up, there were some interesting conversations in the chat. Somebody pointed out that there's an affordable housing summit next month at Pace Law School. I received an email about that, so I was going to forward that on to my mailing lists. So if
Great.
I've been bothering you with all those emails about our sessions, you will get that information as well. Someone asked about getting credit. That's the beauty of Zoom. If you're logged in, I know you're here, so you don't have to do anything unless you're from outside of Rockland and you need a certificate of attendance. Then just send me an email, which I put in the bottom of the chat. Paula, Chris, anything else? I know, Paula, you saw some of those questions. I don't know if you want to talk about them at all, given the time.
I'm like trying to open them back up again. Let's see. I think it was the ADU stuff and mixed use development hasn't gained a foothold in the suburbs. I would say we're trying in some places. I think, the term of retrofitting suburbia is kind of picking up steam in some places more than others. I think of places like Saratoga County where you see more of that happening, where it's a little bit more affluent than some of the older places with like an old Kmart that's dying on your commercial strip. So it could be an opportunity with a lot of that dead retail space to encourage housing in those places. If you also start considering like trying to retrofit it to make it a little bit more walkable and transit friendly as well. So that could be a way of trying to increase density in places where you're kind of already built out. Maybe you don't need all the mega, parking lots anymore, and that you can figure out places to be creative to put some of this housing there. So I would say that's kind of, I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Chris. And then the
No,
other
you said everything I
question
was going to.
was NOAA, the naturally occurring affordable housing, can it be protected without being historic? And I would say, it's a really interesting question. I think with a carefully crafted zoning law, I can't see why not. But I think it would take some interesting finagling to do, but I think it's definitely doable. I should take a look and see if there's anybody kind of working on that. Maybe not so much in New York State, but elsewhere that we can kind of turn to.
Well, I mean, if you keep your bulk regulations to roughly what is existing, you will decrease the incentives for tearing things down.
That's true.
If you can tear down a modest sized house and build a massive McMansion, there's more incentive to do that. If the modest sized house is what's allowed, then less incentive to tear it down.
Right,
that's
right. If buyers, potential speculators know that they're not going to be allowed to expand the footprint. And that's why historic districts are a good example there. 20 years ago, when I was working in preservation, there was a trend of tear downs of mid-century modern houses that nobody wanted to declare historic, but they were being lost at a really high rate. And that's really what I was getting at there, that if the existing building, even if the existing building is torn down, as Adam says, if the footprint remains the same and the zoning is very strict about that, then there'd be less incentive to buy on speculation.
I think that's where we're at.
Okay, well, given the time, I mean, I think there's still some questions in chats, because I'm sorry we didn't get to everyone. It's a dense topic, and I think you did an excellent job covering a very wide variety of the subject. So I just want to say thank you very much to Chris and Paula. I think you've demonstrated just how much of a valuable resource your division is to all the towns and villages throughout New York State. I also want to thank everyone watching tonight and all the work you do when you're not joining us for a training session. I just want to thank you for your efforts and dedication to your community. And I hope you all enjoyed the session. If you are on a board outside of Rockland and need a certificate of attendance, or if you just have a question, please send me an email. I put in the chat a few minutes ago. I'll do that again once I do my official sign off. I also like to remind everyone that on Tuesday, April 26th, we are holding a training session on the overview of the model solar law by NYSERDA. And just keep an eye out for other emails regarding other training sessions that we haven't yet scheduled. So that's all I have. So once again, thank you all very much. And thank you, Chris and Paula, and hope you have a good night.
Thanks so much. Stay well.
Thank you. You too.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night, everybody. Good job.
I'm going to actually-
All right, Mr. Carson.